Satadru Memorial Lecture 2024. Born in Kolkata, January 24, 1969, Professor Satadru moved to the University of California, Berkeley, for his graduate and postgraduate studies. He completed his doctoral studies at the University of Washington. Sen taught at the Washington University in St. Louis and Purdue University, and later at the City University of New York for 12 years. At Queen's College History Department in CUNY, Professor Sen taught courses of Ancient India, Modern India, Pakistan and Bangladesh. He created several upper-level MA courses such as Sex, Society and Indian Cinema, Gandhi and Nonviolence, South Asian Nationalism and Hindu and Muslims in South Asia. He also joined the Graduate Center in 2011 as faculty and directed the Melanese program for students of color wanting to pursue higher education and an academic career. During 2012-13, he brought the Year of India to Queen's College through a year-long film festival screening Indian films every month. Professor Sen's scholarship was his passion through which he sought to expose the iniquities and the hypocrisies wrought by the colonial regimes in South Asia and the Indian Ocean world. His passion and flair for writing was clearly visible in his blog essays, which were marvelous long-form ventures of analysis and observation. He is the author of several books on South Asian history. His 5 single-author monographs include Disciplining Punishment, Colonialism and Convict Society in the Andaman Islands, Migrant Traces, Empire Identity and K.S. Ranjit Singh Ji, Colonial Childhoods, a Juvenile Property of India, 1860 to 1945, Savagery and Colonialism in the Indian Ocean, Power, Pleasure and the Andaman Islanders, and Restoring the Nation to the World, Vinay Kumar Sarkar and Modern India. In addition to these, there are 2 collections of essays, one of them, Traces of Empire, India, America and Post-Colonial Cultures, examines a myriad of interwoven strands of empire and resistance across India, US, Germany and Israel-Palestine. And the other one is co-edited volume with James H. Mills titled Confronting the Body, the Powers of Physicality in Colonial and Post-Colonial India. Professor Satadru had travelled to Presidency University on 12 April 2017 to deliver a lecture titled Indian Perspectives on Fascism and Militarism at the Department of History. An avid traveller who enjoyed riding his motorcycle and an academician per excellence, Professor Sen's sudden demise on the 8th of October 2018 was a great loss for the whole academic world. He is survived by his mother, Professor Korobishin, his wife, Amanda, his daughters, Meera and Bella, and his siblings, Shantanu, Indumati, Aparajita and Priyadarshi. We are indebted to Professor Korobishin, who has always been beside us and is with us today. We are very grateful and honored to host this lecture to celebrate his dedication and writing and teaching history. Professor Korobishin, ma'am, though retired as professor and former head of Department of Philosophy at the University of Bardhaman, is as actively involved in her expertise as reader for Educational Testing Service at Princeton University. She currently divides her time between California and India. On behalf of the Department of History, Presidency University, we would call upon the stage Dr. O. Sarkar to introduce our speaker for today's lecture, Professor Lakshmi Subramanian. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Professor Lakshmi Subramanian is retired Professor of History, Center for Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta, and the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Brits, Pilani. Her specialization and research expertise lies in the histories of music and censorship in the 19th and 20th centuries South Asia, as well as in maritime histories, especially oceanic networks and exchanges in and across the Indian Ocean. Reviewing the critical shifts in Indian Ocean studies, particularly in terms of how the field has come to stand for a new imagining of human and non-human activity, both on the shores as well as in and underwater. Today's lecture is titled Reconfiguring Indian Ocean Studies, Cultural, Spatial and Non-Human Perspectives.
I don't have a PowerPoint, but before, let me thank the organizers of the university, particularly Mridu, who actually buttonholed me to give this presentation. I'm delighted I was able to come, and thank you, Angela, for that graceful introduction. In many ways, I am honored, singularly privileged to give this memorial lecture in memory of a colleague with shared research interests, and also an acknowledgement of the work done by several other trailblazers in this field. So in many ways, coming back to Presidency University for me is like a homecoming. It was here that I cut my teeth with Professor Lakshmi, who in many ways blazed the trail for Indian Ocean Studies. So what I want to do today is to actually provide you with history of the Indian Ocean as it has emerged as a discipline. This is something that would have been laughed at in the 1970s. I remember a workshop that Ashwin Dasgupta and Satadru actually tried to put together in Shanti-Niketan in 79, and established mainstream economic historians said, what? Indian Ocean Studies? What's that? So in many ways, the fact that it has arrived, expanded, consolidated as a subfield of Indian economic history is the story that I'm going to be talking to you today. Feel free to interrupt if you feel that you can't get the drift of what I'm saying. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm aware that holding attention without any visuals is a bit difficult, but please bear with me. Now, I will say that Indian Ocean Studies has come a very long way since the 1970s, when it struggled to define itself as a subfield within the larger field of Indian economic history. It has then, or since, undergone many shifts in both emphasis, content, methodology, and has come to stand for a very new imagining of human and non-human activity, both on the shore, in the sea, and under the sea. Something which is, of course, extremely difficult for historians to recuperate and make sense of. Unlike land, whom we can, in fact, think about more concretely, which has yielded so many interesting analytical categories, the water, and particularly the unbounded water, the sea, is sort of difficult to address conceptually. But since the 70s, we've had very interesting new perspectives that have come up with a very strong critique of the way in which the ocean was imagined, the ocean was understood, and is now on its way, in fact, of a completely new imagination. I will be referencing two important moments in this development of the Indian Ocean historiography. One will be the spatial turn, the fact that we have to look at space and place more productively. What has that done to the Indian Ocean? And at the same time, we have scholars like Tamara Fernando, Sean Lavery of South Africa, who are now urging us to explore the agency of actors like the oyster, like the sea cucumber, like the innocuous barnacle, to think differently about the ocean, what goes underneath, and how does that interact with human action on the shore or on top. Now, given the fact that we are all very close to global warming, particularly the warming of the Indian Ocean, which is warming even more quickly than the other oceans, and the fact that we live in a field of climate emergency, I think it is extremely important for us to start thinking about the history of the Indian Ocean in all kinds of new and productive ways, which will involve thinking differently about the archive, which will involve looking at the ocean itself as the archive for our understanding the traces it leaves behind, and also, in a sense, to put into conversation work done in the past with work being done now. I will use today's occasion to also bring emerging trends right from the 70s, 80s and 90s into conversation with Satadru Sen's pioneering anthropological work on the Andamans, the quintessential maritime space, if you will, and to try and think about the importance of interdisciplinary work, the challenges of interdisciplinary work, what do we do and how do we in fact do what we wish to do, and perhaps try and make a plea not so much for a connected history as a more sensitive history, a granular approach to various spaces in the ocean. It could be a bay, it could be a creek, it could be the high sea. So in other words, to start looking at a more disaggregated view of the ocean, if you will. So I'm not saying that I'm going to make a pitch for dissolving the standard narrative of the ocean as a cogent, connected space, but I'm going to try and present to you the various shifts that have happened in the writing of the history of the Indian Ocean. Now, that the Indian Ocean has come of age historiographically, of that there is no doubt. Although, I will say, as late as 2006, when we had an important forum organized by the American Historical Review, Oceans in History, the Indian Ocean was absent. The Indian Ocean was curiously absent. We had a lot of work on the Pacific, on the Atlantic, and of course on the Mediterranean, but really nothing on the Indian Ocean. Now this omission, this is not to say that we had no work on the ocean, it's just that it did not somehow seem to make it to the metropolitan level where we could think of the Indian Ocean as an important ocean to understand. Now what the omission did in consequence was it generated very productive, I won't say outraged, but certainly passionate, synthesized reviews of historiographical work that was done on the ocean, and which had the advantage of giving us a very good genealogy of the way in which Indian Ocean studies as a discipline evolved, amplified, expanded, and consolidated. You must remember that this is an ongoing process, and more recently, because it has become institutionalized, now Indian Ocean studies will have newer agenda, newer methodological concerns. So it's something, it is really a work in progress. Now, two reviews in particular I was struck by. There are many more, but I'm picking out two for the sake of convenience for my own argument. Two reviews, particularly Marcus Wink, who wrote the Indian Ocean and the New Thalassology, and more recently Edward Alpers, who also wrote a review of the Indian Ocean history and historiography, addressed the lacuna. Why is it that the Indian Ocean did not seem to quite make it? And in doing so, they identified the ways in which Indian Ocean studies research had in fact emerged. So what they did was to talk about its very tentative beginnings in the 50s and 60s, area studies paradigm, certain concerns of the US intelligence, and then moved on to the cross-fertilization of perspectives from the Anand school that looked at the Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean has a historic unity. The very fact that the Mediterranean was one of those seas where people lived, like Socrates said, frogs around the pond, because it so happened that geographically it lent itself to that unity. It does not quite work for the Indian Ocean, and yet there was this cross-fertilization of the Brudelian perspective on the Mediterranean with, of course, larger issues of capitalism and development. So that produced a kind of interest in the Indian Ocean and gave it a certain agenda in terms of content and in terms of perspective. So what did these two reviews do? These two reviews were important because they primarily drew attention to the factors that gave the ocean a certain unity. So the whole idea was to make a pitch for an Indian Ocean world. It's still very amorphous because we really don't quite know what we are talking about in the 60s and 70s, but nonetheless we talked about the ocean, which is determined by geography, the monsoon, the wind system, which facilitates certain kinds of travel to and fro from certain parts of the ocean, some degree of civilizational interaction, and inevitably one talked about Buddhism for the early period and Islam for a later and for a period that went on for a long time, and most importantly, commodity flows that enabled this world of the Indian Ocean to be kept together. So the elements of unity were emphasized in this point of time, and the review articles did justice to this. So you had very extensive review of all that went in to make the trade of the Indian Ocean really a self-sustaining, connecting world with important connections that spread out through the Levant to Europe. You also had some degree of interest in civilizational interaction, not really broke. The idea was there, the incipient idea of civilizational cultural unity mediated through religion, Islam and Buddhism was there. Now, what was curious about these review articles, if you read it now, is that they do not absolutely engage with the kind of historiography that was happening in South Asia precisely at that time. So none of them, for example, mention the work of Irfan Habib, who wrote on the agrarian economy of Mughal India and talked about potentialities of capitalist development in his own scheme. Nor do they quite engage with the kind of work N.K. Sinha did in the University of Calcutta that inspired Ashim Dasgupta to write Malabar and Asian Trade, which is a very interesting book because it's not explicitly structural. Malabar and Asian Trade is really a narrative. It's a narrative of the dynamics of Asian trade in Calicut and Cochin and how they interact with various European powers that come along the coast, and that sort of imagine what to do with water as far as sovereignty is concerned. What do you do with this water? So it's very interesting that there is really no engagement with what is happening in South Asia or Southeast Asia for that matter of fact at that point of time, although I argue that these works that were being done in the 70s and 80s were providing a very strong critique of the Eurocentrist assumption of most global trade that was being talked about. So that is something which is interesting because then you eventually had a case where historiography of South Asia and Southeast Asia differently but converging talked about the importance of looking at Asian trade on its own terms, looking at the resilience of Asian trade, looking at not equivalence that Emmanuel Wallerstein was talking about. So are we still there? Are we one of these? Have we made it? It's not the concern. The concern was to look at how did Asian trade function within the context in which it was operating, both in the continent, in the subcontinent, or in the archipelago in Southeast Asia, or in the east coast of Africa in relation to the ocean. So I found this sort of lack of intersection, if you will, between the kind of history that was being generated and what was happening in South Asia rather interesting. Now, what was important, I think, even more so, particularly with Dasgupta's work, but then followed by a generation of scholars, I'm thinking of R.S. Ratnam, Om Prakash, all of them, were the ability to read European documentation, to mine European documentation, to tell an Asian story. So I think one of the most important things that Dasgupta did was to look at the documentation left behind by European trading companies, in this case the Dutch East India Company, and really read along and against the grain. And he was doing this before the linguistic turn happened. He was doing this as early as the 70s and writing this marvelous narrative of using Dutch documentation to talk about a really local story. So the story is something, that element I think is something that we really need to remember, and of course the impact was of immense significance, encouraged many of us who never quite captured his magisterial style, but many of us to think a little bit about how to use the documentation that we had, how to deal with the lack of documentation in the vernacular as far as commercial history was concerned, and yet try and figure out a way of bypassing silences. So in many ways I think Dasgupta and a whole generation of scholars with him who worked with him and who were inspired by him, I think made an important intervention in developing this field whereby we were looking at activities of merchant enterprise, activities of the early modern state, and notions of what it meant to work with the sea. What did it mean to trade? What did it mean to navigate the sea? So I think that is extremely important. Having said this, I will also say that in this new revisionist historiography that Dasgupta et al. Represented, there was one issue. And this is an issue that has really foreclosed the dialogue between South Asia and Southeast Asia, which is an overemphasis on the hegemony of South Asia in the Indian trade. So we never talk about an Afrasian Ocean. We never talk about what the Chinese and the Southeast Asians do for the Indian Ocean. It's almost always, of course, geopolitically, locationally, South Asia has an advantage, but there was a tendency to exaggerate South Asia's preponderance, which meant there was no conversation between Southeast Asian historians who saw India as the big boss and South Asia, which thought it had everything folded within its subcontinent. So I think this kind of historiographical omissions and commissions are very important when we think about the historical field. Having said that, I will say that South Asia had a natural advantage, and I'm not just talking about location, I'm talking about the manufacturing potential of South Asia, which was able to turn for 200 years extraordinary range of textiles at the most competitive prices and outdid every other supplier in every market. So I think one has to remember this particular manufacturing profile of South Asia to understand why it is so central and it's so important. Now it also meant that when you had this extraordinary concentration of attention on commodities, Indian Ocean studies in the 90s really became all about commodities. You only had hundreds of PhD theses that were turned out that looked at bullion, looked at cotton, looked at textiles, looked at indigo, looked at manufactured stuff, and it's really a commodity-driven story of the Indian Ocean trade, which was not quite, did not give you a social story. That comes again much later, but I'll come to that in a minute. What it did, therefore, was to revive another debate that once again brings this asymmetry of scholarship to our mind. So the whole debate then began about whether Indians, Asians were trading in luxury items, which then necessarily made the trade not socially relevant, or were they trading in necessities, which would make it relevant because you need something, you will store it, you will market it, you will play with the market, you will release prices, all of it speaks to a higher Weberian rationality, which means that Asian trade is as good as the European. So this kind of binary becomes very, very important. So you find a lot of ink spilt on this luxury necessity debate that goes on right through this period, and it is to do with, I suggest, this extraordinary attention that is paid on commodities and this whole bullion for capital, bullion for goods model that most economic historians have talked about, which I will not in fact say much. Now I also want to say that it's also around this time that you have Immanuel Wallerstein and this whole notion of the modern world system, where there is, as you know, a comparison between world empires that are redistributed empires, enterprises, and world systems that is intrinsically capitalist and therefore more efficient. So the whole question is, where does India stand? Because in the classic world system of Immanuel Wallerstein, India really doesn't stand in. It's neither a core, of course, it's not a periphery, nor is it a semi-periphery. So where did India stand? So this whole business of the world system analysis then once again brought the problem of how do you position this vitality of the Indian Ocean trading world with commodities going everywhere, with communities and networks of merchants handling the commodities, robust networks, credit practices, very sophisticated. How do you then position all this? So this became a serious question, and we then have a third moment in the development of the Indian Ocean Studies paradigm, and that, of course, is the connected histories paradigm that is put forward by Sanjay Subramanian. Now, Sanjay Subramanian, as many of you may know here, works extensively on Portuguese and Dutch documentation and English and French, and of course he has a lot to say about trade, about politics, about the nature of Asian enterprise, but he also tried to put forward a connected histories approach. How do you study the Indian Ocean? Besides talking about the monsoon that determines sailing schedules, besides talking about monsoon that gives India the productive manufacturing potential and food, how do you actually make sense of connections? Of course, you make sense of connections mediated through Islam, but also mediated through experiments in state building. So a lot of attention was then given by Sanjay Subramanian and people who have followed his work on reconfiguring the boundaries of the Indian Ocean through the lens of both religion and empire. So his whole thesis with connected histories was, of course, how a sort of fraternity of empires and states brought scribes, military laymen, merchants, legal jurists, experts together to produce a common within empires and states. So we are told, for instance, how the Arakan ruler, a kind of outlier, if you like, in the whole world of the Indian Ocean, conducted his diplomatic correspondence in Persian, and yet he said that his sovereignty came not because of Persian, but because of the association he had with the Telangas of the continent. So there's an imagination which is now being articulated within the Indian Ocean, and which, according to Sanjay, really talks of a very different understanding. You know, you're gesturing to a kind of Indian Ocean cosmopolitan space. You know, a space that's always had commercial connections, a space that has had religious and cultural interactions, a space that is now taking recourse to a common Islamic political vocabulary of law, but also of Islamic obligations about credit and debit. So you have a new sea, which Bishara would call a sea of debt, a sea of reciprocal obligations. So we are gesturing to a connected world based on shared practices, mutuality. Now, around the same time, and this is a little bit of a digression, but I think it's very important, around the same time, you have an important initiative in the 2000s coming from the University of Technology in Sydney, run interestingly by the English and the Humanities Department, that urged a cultural studies approach to Indian Ocean studies. So you've had so far a sort of historical, economic historical, primarily commercial history, historians of law and custom, but now you have strong cultural studies input being put into the Indian Ocean, where it is now being argued that we need to get away from this nation-centric approach, we need to look at this space and cultural terms, and we need to look at a very different set of imaginations. It could be performances, it could be clothing, it could be the ways in which textiles are used for rituals. And so you have a very important issue that is put forward by Devlina Ghosh and Stephen Muki, who talk about the cultural turn in the Indian Ocean studies. So that is something which I think we need to keep in mind, because all of this is happening at a time when Indian Ocean studies is actually developing as a discipline within certain university departments. Now, this does not, and I think what is important is that all these approaches have important implications on the way research continues to be generated. And this is where I think what happens in the 2000s and thereafter is important, because you have a series of very important work that is raising new questions with somewhat older material, but also with older understanding of archives. And I wanted to put in mind three kinds of work that's happening. One is a material cultural approach taken up by scholars like Elizabeth Lambourne, who is a historian of Jewish practices. She unpacks the baggage of a traveling Jewish merchant and makes sense of the objects. You know, what do the objects tell you? How did he live in Cochin? Did he need all the stuff that he wanted for his ritual? And she really does this semiotic reading of objects and comes up with a very different material history, if you like, of the Indian Ocean. I also want to place here on record some of the very interesting work being done on merchant networks. I'm thinking of Shantanu Sargupta's work, I'm thinking of Soren Men's work, I'm thinking of Arsalanian's work, all of whom are now looking at merchant networks who knit the ocean through processes of reciprocity and notions of honor. How do you reciprocate, and how they mediate a particular world through what Sebu calls the culture of correspondence? How do you write to each other? And what do their epistles tell you? What is this epistolary culture all about? How does it give you a sense of the space? Do we immediately say it's cosmopolitan? No need to. But what is happening here? So it doesn't mean there are no tensions. But I think there is a real sense in which the older idea of the cosmopolitan is being deepened by the kind of work that's happening, which is very archival, very historical. And of course, in this, the work done by Fahad Bishara, who looks at warak, legal agreements between creditor and debtor. You know, who owes me, what money and how do I get it? All of this creates a web of shared obligations that give the Indian Ocean a particular unity. So this is, again, it's a brilliant book which I would suggest all students here to read. It's just brilliantly written. So Vishara then talks about this cosmopolitan Indian Ocean, and he makes a very important point saying that let's just not put it to some wishy-washy culture or custom. It's actually got the sanctity of law. So he's actually making a very interesting point about the congruence and the co-constitution of a legal culture between Arabic practices and Western legal culture, which of course will come in the 18th and 19th century. So I think it's well worth thinking about how larger developments within the historical field is impacting practices in the Indian Ocean and how that is also coming back. A second set of interventions which I think has been very important in the case of the Indian Ocean is associated with Niall Green, who looks at the languages. He works on Bombay Islam, but he has made wonderful review essay that he comes up with, where he talks about the production of textual economies in the Indian Ocean. And this is of course heavily Islam-based. So what kind of Islamic correspondence, juridical practices, legal understanding of regulating communities in the Indian Ocean, regulating practices in the Indian Ocean, what kind of history can we write about that? And here there are very important works that have come, and I'm thinking of Annie Bang's work for the for the Middle Indian Ocean, West Asia. I'm thinking of Kai Press for Swahili, East Africa. I'm thinking of Torsten Toscher for Tamils and Malaya. So you really have a very interesting new perspective on the Indian Ocean, which is far removed from cotton cloth, indigo, cowrie, porcelain. This is a very different kind of world that we are now dealing with. And of course the argument being that for far too long we have dealt with the hegemonic European languages. We now need to look at the sea in its own language, in its own archive, which is in its own vernacular. So far so good, and I think these have been very, very important. But there's one interesting strand that keeps popping up, and it's in this backdrop that I really want to think about Satadru's own work, which certainly inspired me. But I also want to think about the fact that in all of this, the peoples of the sea were missing. You never almost had anything about the fisherman. You never had anything about the ordinary sailor. An occasional document that will tell you the wages of a sailor, if you were lucky. Of course, you'll get it in the colonial times, but I'm talking about even the early modern period, very little. You would have almost nothing about the raider, the predator, the pirate, who are always seen as oppositional to the mainstream authority. And of course, in the case of the Indian Ocean, because so many segments of the rim societies got colonized, we really find the marginal peoples really erased out of the history of the ocean. So I want to turn my attention to this because I think it's important. In a sense, we have this whole idea put forward by Sujit Saraswathan that we need to think about subaltern biographies, right? We have to look at small men. Do they leave any trace at all? What kind of biographical impressions can we get? Very little, but what can we do? I think it is in this process, in this backdrop of looking for the marginal, looking for the voiceless, that Satadru's work on the Andamans became so important. The fact that he looked at islands was important, because this is really the quintessential maritime space we almost never talk about. If you look at any, there are some great islands and beaches, of course, all my all-time favorite. But if you look at it in the Indian Ocean context, where do you ever have a history of an island? Even the history of Goa, which in many ways is a series of islands, is almost never spoken about through its island profile. It's always spoken from either the conversion angle or from the hinterland. So there's a way in which islands themselves have become marginal spaces in the history of the ocean. The same goes for bays, for gullies, for creeks. These are quintessential maritime spaces, a little amorphous because you don't know when land begins, land ends, and the sea begins. Those intersectional spaces are almost never talked about. And so, in many ways, when he took the Andamans, he took hold of the Andamans, he was actually making a very important point about the production of space within the sea. And he made a further point that he was interested not just in the island, which he was, but he was interested in the process of islanding. How did you island these islands? How did you populate? The strong comment on the production of the savagery discourse. And it's a very, very interesting discourse because it's not a monolithic project. It's not homogeneous. It is something that emerges over time. It comes out of a period of great confidence when you think you're going to populate everything and you're going to civilize the savage. And then there is a moment of retreat when you're not quite sure. So the discourse changes, and I think this is extremely important because he is able to, by the production of the discourse and the resistance to it, he actually talked about some kind of resistance. So the first time you actually had, and of course he was following the line of several labor historians. I'm thinking of Claire Anderson. People were thinking of mobility, people were thinking of resistance. How do people resist? But he was taking this anthropological perspective and giving us a really rare micro-historical perspective on resistance in the islands. Now for me, the production of colonial discourse and savagery was crucial when I attempted understanding the phenomena of piracy and predation in the northwestern littoral of the Indian Ocean. So my last book on the Indian Ocean is really about piracy, and I was trying very hard to figure out how to describe it, and not as a law and order problem that the deep state talks about, because they'll say that anyway. But going beyond that, how does one understand this phenomenon? Do we look at it as some kind of response to livelihood? Do we look at it as some kind of response to disposition? Do we look at it as some kind of response to an environmental crisis? Do we look at it as a resource that states used for state building? Because in Southeast Asia and in parts of South Asian littoral economies, political rulers, coastal bosses made use of the fishing and the smaller population to actually undertake raiding voyages, both to redeem debt but also as a means of punishment. So we are not here talking about the kind of piracy that we associate with Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake, which is kind of heroic and privateering for an empire. But when it comes to the Indian pirates, always a careless pirate, a raider, not enemy of the land. So there is this very strange anomaly, and I was really trying to figure out how to understand the this phenomena of predation. And what I did, and here this is where I really took my cue from his work, was to look at two things. I was fortunate in the sense that my archive happened to yield fascinating pirate depositions. I was lucky. Between 1810 and 1814, when several pirates were rounded up and they were forced to, a confession was extracted and then translated. A lot was lost in translation, but I had depositions to go by. I had autobiographical histories. Now they could have been made up, but the whole challenge is to speculate on what it's like. Everyone, for example, will say we've been pirates for 7 generations. It's a trope. But you will also have a guy who says that I've worked as a navigator for Captain Bottom. So, you have to make out, as a historian, you have to read between these spaces to make sense. So I was lucky in that I had these depositions. I was also lucky in that the colonial state in the late 18th, early 19th century really came up with a massive ethnographic survey of Kathiawar and Kutch and Dwarka, which is the stronghold of the pirate communities, and came up with a very interesting discourse. Now, again, the discourse was not uniform. You had men who were sympathetic, men who were outright offensive, and so you had altercations and you had divisions within the colonial establishment. So you really had a punctured discourse, so, which made it very useful for us to sort of think about predation in the Indian Ocean. And I found that adopting a spatial perspective really helped. So instead of simply looking at piracy as a phenomenon, I went deeper and thought about two words, the Darya, which is the sea, and the Khadi, which is the creek. And both these terms, which are again used in different ways in both colonial documentation and later documentation in the vernacular, suggested very different imaginations of what you did in the water. And that gave me a sort of angle to understand this very complex politics that was being fought out in this ambiguous space between land and sea, and how these were expressed. So, for example, the pirate would say, this is our customary activity, this is what we do, we thieve, and then we go back to our boats. You need us because we are great navigators, but then when we can do nothing, we are always taking the blame, you are taking the gain, we have to rebel. So there's a kind of that deposition. On the other hand, you have Europeans who are coming in, and because it's in Dwarka, and because the temple at Dwarka takes a cut from all the proceeds of piracy, it is seen as sanctioned by God, particularly the cowherd thief Krishna. So you have these very interesting discourses that converge, and it remained for me to think about subordinate agency, colonial discourse, and what one did with it. So in the end, I therefore argued that one had to look at this whole phenomena in the early 19th century through the lens of circulation, of mobility, of resistance. Occasionally, I wouldn't overstate it, because they resisted everybody. Most of the pirates that I have encountered in my depositions went against everybody, whether it was the Rao of Kutch or the ruler of Jamnagar or the company, it didn't matter. They were, they just broke out. And there you have a sense of that episodic subaltern resistance that we talk about. You capture it only when it is failed. So you got that. So I did try and write about the salty subaltern when it came to piracy. So I want to sort of take up one important aspect of the new Indian Ocean historiography that's happening, and that is to really think a little bit about not just connections and synthesized knowledge and circulation, but I also want to think a little bit about non-human-human interactions, because this is something which I think is coming to the fore. If you look at the latest work that's happening from, say, the Ocean Humanities Project in Witwatersrand in South Africa, there is a real desire to go deep and to think more carefully about representations of the ocean and the depths of the ocean, and to try and think about it completely differently. So there's that Ocean Humanities institutional framework, but there's also a very interesting intervention that is coming from scholars like Tamara Fernando, who is saying that we really need to start writing a multi-species history of the ocean. We cannot simply write about man's interaction, and as historians, where else will we find our material? I mean, oysters won't talk to me. So I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that there is a way in which a multi-species history of the ocean is being proposed, and this is something that Tamara Fernando does brilliantly. Again, a paper that I would urge all of you, interested or not, to read. Is really done brilliantly. So I would argue that with Sujit Simson, I'll tell you how she works it out. So I therefore say that I don't want to give up the idea of connections and connectedness. I don't want to say that everything is disaggregated and we have to look at the creek differently and the bay differently, but I'm simply saying that the ocean is teasing you all the time. We think we've got it, we think we've got the actors and the agency, and then suddenly something happens which completely sabotages the narrative. And that, I think, is important for us to remember, particularly when we look at the relations between man or a human and a non-human when we explore the history of the ocean. So this is what Tamara does. Her protagonist is the oyster. And the oyster and for valid reasons, because she's after the pearl. We attach value to the oyster, gastronomical delight and gift, and of course the value because of the pearl. So she's not interested in a commodity per se orientation. She's looking at pearling. She uses the word like islanding of Satadru said. She's using the word pearling, and she's trying to uncover how to understand a fishery off the Gulf of Mannar between Sri Lanka and India. How do you understand the pearl fishery? Do you only understand it through a mode of extractive labor, which you do? Because you have the colonial state, you have established a fishery, you have your divers catalog, you have diver 1, diver 2, diver 3, you have measured like good panoptical state that the diver can go that deep, this diver can go only that deep, and you have it all written out and very, very scrupulously done. But sometimes the oysters have their own rhythm. They don't like something, or they have found sharks in the bay, and everything goes, and the span of the oysters don't happen, so the fishery collapses. So she is actually making this very strong argument. Interesting account fishing, talks to fishermen on both sides of Sri Lanka, Ceylon and Sri Lanka and India, but she also delves deep into natural history reports of the late 19th, early 20th century about oysters, about sharks, about divers, and really tries to look at the ocean not as a history of commodity, but as a history of, what she calls coralline capitalism. She's looking at the disappearing reef, she's looking at all these men, she's looking at this very precarious balance that capitalism has produced. And so how do you then write a history that goes simply beyond commodities and commodity value chains, but actually look at ecology? So there's a way in which I'm saying that Indian Ocean Studies has really moved from its beginnings that looked at peddler, luxury, necessity, commodity states to ecology. Of course, in many ways, it's of direct relevance to us. We live in this state of emergency. We need to know about global warming. And of course, we as historians can't be averse to going beyond the waves. We have to do it. Now, how we do it remains challenging. How do we develop our when we talk about interdisciplinary methodologies, how do we actually do it? And I think it is here that Indian Ocean Studies, because it's becoming rapidly institutionalized, really needs to ask certain questions. But how do we do it? Where we go from here? And what kind of questions we can ask? Not on the shore, not of simply commodities, but what goes below the shore and under the step. So I'll stop there.
Floor is now open for questions. Please raise your hand.
Someone else will go first. I can you hear me, right? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. My name is Shukona. I wrote to you a couple of weeks ago. So this is a fantastic presentation. Thank you, and a much needed intellectual intervention, because a lot of us have started learning a little about these new developments, but I think we're still very far away from them. And as you said, that what goes on under the waters is so difficult to understand, assess, or even imagine. So I just wanted to share a bit of something from my own work for the last 1 year.
Which, by the way, I saw and really enjoyed.
Okay, so although I'm working with the conch, but from very varied perspectives, the diving perspective being just one. As I was listening to you, I thought there's one aspect that makes this narrative even richer, which is the aspect of time. Because of course we're writing a history of knowing the Indian Ocean, but the moment we think about the subaltern perspective on it, there's a very different kind of temporality that is at play. Because for this, so when we went in with the work, we had all these lofty ideas about what climate is doing to the waters, acidification, calcareous animals, etc. And of course, there are these series of bans that have come on the divers, very recent ones as well, when they're being asked not to go in. But the interesting thing is, like you said, that the animals are also resisting because they are the ones moving deeper, and that is why the divers are trying to compete, dying in the process, etc. What was interesting is that the divers have no, at least that's how I read it, they are not having any sense of the future. So what they say is, this is about our generation. We know that pearls became almost obsolete 50 years ago, and the conches are going to be extinct in another 50. So there is a strange sense of direness with which they speak. So they say this very emphatically.
Okay.
And they say that, so it's not about our future generations. We are not teaching our sons how to dive. It's us. We know what to do with our livelihood. We are reaching them. We are going in illegally. There will be more bans. We'll go in illegally. Despite that, And that's how we'll survive. So just as they have this idea of the depth of the ocean which holds so much, but there is that time, and then there is the superficial water time, where they see that it's acidified, it's warmed, it's our lifetime, and then it ends. So I think this kind of a temporality does something very different and very interesting to what we are going to think about the question of history writing.
Very good.
And so there's another very interesting anthropologist called Stephen Helmrich. He does a lot of underwater ethnography as well. And he is also using Amitabh Ghosh to write a little about the superficial time vis-a-vis the deep time with the ocean metaphor. So I thought that can add really interesting perspectives to
That's
this
a fascinating input actually you give me, because if you look at the way in which it
Really nothing, because I am presently working on very initials, and I am not finding any centralized archive at all. 18th century, 17th century.
very difficult.
What happens to the non-human turn? I mean, based on the
very difficult. But in fairness, let us look at Tamara's work more carefully. You will find that a substantial section of her writing is looking at divers and the records of the diverse society and of the fishery. Basically, galvanizing labor for fishery. That's one section. She's also talking a lot about poetic representations of pearls, diving, sharks, what you find in the shoreline, what you don't. She has actually expanded her archive. So, in many ways, she is an interdisciplinary scholar. She is not fixated on the colonial archive. She's very critical of the colonial archive, but she's using it very judiciously. She's using it, if you actually look at the first two sections of the paper, Seeing the Sea, I don't know if you've seen it, it borrows from Sri Lankan poetry, from Tamil poetry, from literary representations, from anthropological conversations with fishermen she's had in Sri Lanka, and compares it. So I think it's the skill, it really is where your heart is. For her, it is something that drives her to look at the humble mollusk, but really with the larger concerns of warming, ocean warming, and moments of degraded environmental exploitation. I think, and that intention is worked into the way in which she expands the archive. So I think in fairness, I'm not saying that all of us can do it or all of us are comfortable doing it. But if you wish to do the kind of interdisciplinary work that Indian Ocean Studies is now demanding, institutionally, I'm not saying as a historian you have to do it, you can be I'll be perfectly happy to read a thesis on maritime insurance, no problem. But I'm saying that if you are going to do that kind of interdisciplinary work, and if your intention is to braid the economic with the ecological, then I think there is no, you just have to be able to be open and dive in, metaphorically.
Question, but I don't want you to stop talking. So I was just struck, again, these are just random thoughts, and forgive me, I don't do Indian Ocean Studies, so this is very, very valuable for me. Struck also by something that that Shubhana brought up and that you responded to, this notion of crisis, right? I mean, surely some notion of crisis has always struck communities, right? I mean, I think we know more or maybe less, but what we know about the current crisis is a little more frightening, but given states of knowledge, right? In some ways, that idea that there's an apocalyptic end can be triggered just as a historian at different moments in the past as well, right? I don't know if there's something, I mean, I've also been listening to lectures about the Anthropocene and how it's how it's a matter of concern. So that's just an aside, as I said, it's really just to make sure you're still talking and someone doesn't say end of lecture. But on a different note, I mean, when you're talking about pirates and with coastal communities, there's a sense, is there a sense of people living neither on land, not looking both to the ocean and to the land? This notion of being on a
amphibious. They are amphibious creatures, which are over in land,
right? And is that something that you see shared in by different? Is there something common to different coastal communities? I won't say across the world, but how I mean, after all, the sense that we are pirates. There's a sense that, well, we're defined by the laws of a land-based state. Those, are you governed by the laws of the ocean, of the land, ecology?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, that's at the heart of the book that I wrote. I think that I can't speak for, and I'm hoping students of mine do it at some point. Maybe Rukmini will think about it, Bay of Bengal. I do think that communities along the western littoral share certain practices. For one, their religious affiliation is very fluid. So you would have my men who undertook pirate cruises, would have a Gomes, an Almeida, a Mapla, a Khatri, a Kuli. They would have several interesting titles, and from which I can't immediately say one is from Malabar. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that there is a Eurasian element, there's a Christian element. Most of them visit the temple to give their proceeds, but are not allowed inside the sanctum. Most of them have Sufi peers to look after their families when they go on their pirate voyages. So we are clearly talking about a community which is really liminal. And it's a community that I think, particularly in Kathiawar, it's a very interesting symbiotic relationship between the Rajputs who colonized Kathiawar and the local seafaring population, and what the Vadelas did. But the mix is really quite interesting. And I think it descends along the coast. There is a sense of a certain looseness, of fluidity. Certainly for my time. Of course, things change. By the early 20th century, when the tribes and caste project happens, or when ethnographic accounts are being written of the outlaws by Indian nationalists, then of course there's a lot of ironing out that is happening, which will make it impossible for us to excavate lines of continuity. But speaking for the coast, I will say that there is definitely a sense that we can rely on shared networks of intelligence. So when the pirate in Kathiawar is deciding to make an expedition, he says, we just got information 10 days ago that a schooner from Bombay is leaving port. So get ready. So that kind of networks of information, networks of circulation, I think, give a certain sharedness to these communities. Having said that, I'm not saying there are no differences, no divergences. Many of them turn approvers. Many of them join the company's marine force. Many of them join warring states. So, without discounting any of this, I do think that as a community, there's a lot of fluidity. There is a lot of a sense that here we have a customary right to certain kinds of raiding activity. And it is a seasonal activity. I don't think we should ever think of them as permanent pirates. They are not. They go and harvest. It depends on the season, it depends on what there is, whether there's work to do. And some of the administrators were very sensitive to this. So Alexander Walker, whose private papers I actually looked at from the book, he was particularly sensitive to the reality. So he said, you're making a terrible mistake by lumping all of them as pirate communities. They're not. There are some pirate states who will not accept the law of the land, which is our law, but there are some who accept the customary laws of the sea. So there are gradations, I think, and it requires very careful investigation of the archive to be able to answer the kind of question you're asking. Now, whether this shared along the Indian Ocean is a very different question. I would suspect that the Orang Laut in Southeast Asia, the maritime peoples of the sea, had a much more robust understanding of their rights in the sea, because it's a much more island experience. Southeast Asia is really an archipelago. They are much more maritime than, say, even our littoral peoples. So I would think that there's a way in which the ocean has to be disaggregated if one is to make sense of these shared practices. So I wouldn't go that far to say that there is a real shared sense of being part of a brotherhood, but I will also say that they plug into circuits of information and circulation. These men, I've pursued some of them. They have moved from Bhavnagar, south of Gujarat, to Kathiawar, they go to Kutch, and then they go to Makran, and then they go to the Jawasvi, to the Gulf, to the Trucial coast. When British colonization of the littoral is complete and they're beginning their relations with the Emirates, they've all moved there. So evidently there is a corridor, there is a mobile maritime corridor which they're able to use effectively. But for that again, I have to do a mid-19th century history, but it is waiting to be done. I do believe, I stay with the argument that I put forward, that you can only understand these extreme activities, you can call it predation, call it whatever you will, you have to understand it through the lens of circulation and mobility. These men are mobile, they're extremely gifted, they are superb commanders, they also are men of their space, they are very good in the creek, they're not so good with the open sea. And so the company, which is excellent on the open sea, is unable to defeat them. Till 1840, these guys are still fighting them. So, I think that's when I mean that one has to look at space and geography and the production of relations within that space to be able to understand Indian Ocean studies. And to that extent, I think the savagery discourse really helped me. Because Sen was really interested in going into that understanding of how is this discourse produced, what does it do, how does it impact social relations, and how does it persuade resistance. So I think that model for me actually helped. When I look back, it helped more than I thought it did then.
This question of spatiality and a kind of zonal histories, because Indian Ocean Studies has moved and thrived in so many ways that it is coming up within a literary field, it's coming up within a history field, and it's coming up perhaps in oceanography studies, but also maybe within a certain. So I'm actually asking a very basic question about cartography. And I remember having this conversation with Ranabi Chakraborty around his book, The Pull Towards the Coast, which is that how do you create boundaries within an ocean? So I know that cartography creates them. So you have to divide oceans between seas and oceans and bays and creeks, everything have names. But I'm asking a more general question in terms of how would you define, because it seems it's always from a position which is not from within this ocean but from outside. One is thinking about a zone within an ocean that one is not just naming cartographically, but that is also somewhere something that is being navigated not by those who are navigating the ocean alone, but interdisciplinary scholars who are dealing with that area. So I'm actually thinking if Indian Ocean Studies is like an area studies, and it could then, like area studies, have several nation forms involved in it. So in terms of territoriality, one can see that there are literal histories around which oceans are plotted. But I'd like to know a bit more about the mapping and what distinguishes spatially this oceanic belt. Not just say vis-a-vis the Bay of Bengal or the Arabian Sea, but because it's a long stretch. So would you have similar confederation of, say, Pacific studies or Atlantic studies emerging in the same way that an Indian Ocean Studies is? I mean, it could be coming from my not knowing enough of the field at all. But I'm still intrigued because, again, there are those who man these boundaries too. And I'm here bringing up a very personal experience that I had on how you divide waters. We know that dividing land itself is such a tricky and difficult process because it is so porous, any boundaries you create. We were in the Sundarban and we were in the waters, and at one point we were told that this is Bangladesh. So when does that happen? So we know that anyway the boundary between Bangladesh is so difficult to maintain, but within the waters, and very interestingly, the boatmen, people who were taking us, knew And there was also very interestingly that there were boats going by where namaz was being conducted. So is it that cultural trait? It could have been on this side of the ocean too. I mean, on this side of the border too. So I've been interested in how people who navigate, who live daily with these boundaries. Now with Bengal and Bangladesh, it would be a very important boundary. But I'm just saying, once you're in the deeper seas, what is this sense of the zone where the Arabian Sea stops? And maybe they begin. And also in terms of historians and everybody working with the zone, what is the definition of the zone? Because it seems Indian Ocean Studies is taking the Indian Ocean as given.
Yeah.
So what is nonetheless
That's a great question. But let me start by saying that the Indian Ocean Studies now is actually not taking the ocean as given, and the whole idea therefore is to disaggregate it. So to not think about it as a connected sea which is sort of uniform, but to make these distinctions. But the other question that you asked is actually much, much more important, interesting and difficult one to answer. If I just were to rely on, first of all, I think we have to make a distinction between the high seas and the rim societies. I think that is important because most of the societies on the coast would have a rudimentary notion of its territorial waters, and that is not a nation state given. The Maratha Navy was very clear about what its territorial waters was. The Portuguese in Goa were very clear where you had to stop. So there is a sense in which territorial waters of each coastal state, the Zamorin of Calicut was very clear. So I think there is a sense of where my sovereignty extends to, but it's quite close to the coast. I don't think Indian states on the whole conceptualized a sovereign dominion over the high seas. This has always been the argument of Western scholars that, look, Britannia ruled the waves because the whole emphasis of inter-European rivalry was the high sea. In our case, the rivalry is a literal rivalry. It's not on the high sea. So I think that is one distinction that we need to remember. For historians, it's much harder. It's very hard for me to decide whether I'm actually, when I study East Africa sometimes, and not even through piracy, but if I study the circulation of certain kinds of textiles that are cultivated purely for a Swahili market in Kutch, and it goes only to the Swahili market, am I really looking at an Afrasian Sea? Am I still looking at the Western Indian Ocean? Am I looking at the Arabian Sea? It's a very difficult question for me to ask. One has to be very sensitive because these have become political questions. If you go and speak to an African Studies department without recentering the Indian Ocean, you will be asked and saying, why is it that there is such a preponderant emphasis on India in a particular space where African enterprise, African capital, African consumption seems to dominate. So it's a very tricky question to actually answer. But in terms of cartography, it's very interesting that I think every coastal principality in the Indian littoral was very conscious of where their territorial waters lay. I came across a fascinating case between the Nawab of Junagadh and the Rab of Kutch, who fought over a mysterious depth where he said, those fish that belong to me. So take your boat away. So now, obviously he didn't know what lay underneath, but there's a way in which I think notions of control, notions of what you could do and could not do, where your trading pass or license could hold, I think did hold sway. So cartographically, it's not as if that the littoral doesn't have a sense of, spheres of influence, I'll put it there. But I think in terms of this bleeding into the high ocean, does it really exist? I've found very few Indian rulers, excepting rulers of Calicut and the Mamalis of Kannur, who try and control the Lakshadweep and the Maldives. Otherwise, you really do not have a case where the high seas is part of a domain of sovereignty. The question that I think was asked by Nidhu but sort of connects with you is, what law do you follow? Is it the law of the land or is it the law of the sea? And is there a law of the sea? So it's a difficult question because If you look at colonial discourse, pirates are enemies of mankind because they do not follow the law of the sea. Because they attack, and it's a case of robbery at sea. So it's, on the other hand, for the pirate, the argument would be, you have come and imposed certain convoy arrangements and interfered with our natural navigational, so we have to resist. So there is a way in which the idea of adhering to certain legal spaces remains very, very ambiguous and ambivalent throughout the period. So cartographically, yes, it is the European who imposed the names that this is where the Middle Indian Ocean, you know, if you look at the way the Indian Ocean is divided into the Middle, the Arabian and the Bay of Bengal, it's really a 1920 project. Moreland did it for the first time. We didn't have that before. You know, you just, you know, you look at it. On the other hand, I do believe that every coastal principality is very conscious of the extent to which it can control. And control would be fishing rights, control would be customs over boats that come into your ports. That would be the kind of apparatus that you would need to define your sovereignty.
But for instance, when you're at the tip of India, there's a sense that the three oceans meet. Now, that's not a need. So I'm just thinking in terms of the spatial nature of the ocean. So the way it is identified is through different sands and often through different colors of the waters. I'm just trying to think, so there is a cultural mythology also that when you're at the tip of India, they're actually having these oceans which come together. So it interests me that it seems that oceans then do have identities, they do have features, and I'm not just thinking here of legality alone, but I'm thinking they may have features like land, where these finer differentiations are both cultural and mythological perhaps, but they also perhaps emerge through knowledges of the waters and water life and everything that inhabits.
You're absolutely right. One cannot discount the materiality of the ocean. There is a very strong material presence. I mean, we know, for example, that the Bay of Bengal is subject to the most violent typhoons and hurricanes, and therefore you have a big mythology of this being a dangerous sea. You always have the mythology of the Arabian Sea being like a calm bath water, which has changed now, because you're having too many storms in the Arabian Sea, which was unheard of. So sure, there are geophysical, geographical, material features which are then added on to by cultural representations of different kinds. So I'm not discounting it, but I think right now when you are, when you're bombarded by different kinds of representations, you have a colonial archive, you have literary representations, you have actual experience, you have the law, then you will have to figure out how to put back, what Pearson said, how do you put back the ozone into the sea? I mean, how do you put the material back into the sea?
Here and see all the smiling faces of the students and their respectable teachers. I know that Satadru first crossed the Indian Ocean when he was 14. We went to the Andamans, and that had aroused tremendous interest in him and about the ocean and the islands. And after that, of course, he moved beyond many oceans to the States, but for him, through his work, he found out that the ocean could be as much of a barrier as a tool of expansion, a medium of expansion. When we talk about the insular mindset, how the ocean surrounds you and you become an islander cut off from the rest of the world, or the ocean could be an invitation to cross far to many other countries. So he always thought that the ocean is the best way to expand oneself. It is what makes us migrate to, helps us entertain the idea of going to other countries, mixing with other people. We have heard today a lot about trade and piracy and all the other related activities and experiences. but at the same time it is also self-expansion. Satadru believed that by crossing the ocean we could expand ourselves. We could really become cosmopolitan. The ocean can help us break down barriers and borders and become cosmopolitan selves. So it's a question of self-identity, how to not close down your identity. When we have the Bangladesh waters, the division, that was an excellent reference. I have seen that also, how this is where Indian waters end and the Bangladesh waters begin. And we all know about the Hindu custom of cutting the waters prior to marriage, that you really cannot separate two identities, two people, by just like we cannot cut the waters. But at the same time, if we can get over insularity, the insular mindset, and become cosmopolitan selves, not become closed selves, not have closed identities, then that would be the best fruit, I think, of, let's say, ocean studies, not just Indian ocean studies, but landscapes everywhere, all kinds of landscape help us develop certain kinds of personalities. So self-expansion, Satadru would always talk about his aversion to joining groups, memberships, because that makes us be loyal to one particular school of thought, one particular way of looking at the world. So he would always hesitate to join any kind of groups. And he believed that self-expansion can also help us to acquire multiple selves, and that was not at all unachievable, that it was in fact a very commonplace human experience to have to acquire multiple selves. We constantly switch our roles in life. The same person is a sister, a mother, a daughter, a wife, a teacher, and same with the other sex also. The same person has to play different roles in their lives all the time. It's not natural, it is normal. We may not always be aware of what we achieve through it really. We achieve coherence within ourselves, we achieve organization within ourselves by playing multiple roles, and at the same time we help the rest of the world also achieve organization by being organized ourselves. And if you talk about cinemas or dramas or theaters, how do the actors, the great actors and actresses, become successful? Because they can become the role they are going to play. In real life, they may not be at all like the role they are going to be playing, whether it's the role of a hero or the role of a villain. How do we play the role of a villain so perfectly? Because we have within us that other villain whose role we are going to play. Unless we have it within us, we could never identify with that. Similarly, if we are going to play the role of a heroine or a hero, we have that noble self also within us. Unless we can identify with that other hero or heroine, we will never be successful actors. So that's about it, I think, that the ocean can help us liberate ourselves, expand ourselves, just as it can also help us get insulated. Like the doors and windows in our house. When we close the doors, we are inside the house, feeling safe and secure. But if we need to go out, we have to open the same door. The same door makes us, a creature of the interior, and the same door can make us belong to the world. It's about how we look at it and what we want to do. Okay? Thank you.
That we extend our immense gratitude on behalf of the department, Presidency University, to Professor Lakshmi Subramanian for the lecture. We want to thank Professor Sen for her presence. We would also like to thank the Vice Chancellor, Registrar, Development Officer, the Seminar Committee and Sound System staff for the constant support. Once again, we would like to thank every one of you for being here today, and we hope to see you again at many more events in the future. One quick announcement. I would request everybody to vacate the hall as early as possible because we have a philosophy lecture from 4. So